Thanks for having us. My name is Nick Bibeau. I am the Assistant Chief at the Newberry Fire Department in Newberry, New Hampshire. And as Emily said, I also work for the New Hampshire Fire Academy. I'll be the next captain for the Instructor, Investigator, and Inspector programs. And with me is Robert Cousins. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Robert Cousins. I'm the Quality Assurance Officer for McGregor Memorial EMS in Durham, New Hampshire.
So thanks again for having us. This is an important topic that has been unfolding for the last over 12 months now at this point. So this began as an effort for me, my local department, to find someone who was an expert in this field, a subject matter expert, in reducing the use of lights and sirens. And through the course of my investigation, and if anyone's familiar with state work, I wasn't able to find anyone in New Hampshire that had this exact style of presentation available. And so I linked up with the folks at McGregor and Robert Cousins, and so we've come together with what we feel is a fantastic overview of this topic. We do want to mention that we're not specifically endorsing any very specific set of SOPs or guidelines in any way, shape, or form. What we're doing here is simply providing information so that you're able to begin the discussion in your respective agencies. So given the format today, this is going to be a slightly abridged version. This was designed as a 2-hour program. So given the format and the technological aspects, we expect this will be a little less interactive than we had originally intended for this. But we're going to work through. I'll take the first half. Robert's going to take the second half, and we're going to do our best to leave some time at the end for questions. So we'll go ahead and get started. What you're about to see in front of you, you won't have any audio, but this is a collection of videos that we were able to put together at the Ed Tech department at the Fire Academy in New Hampshire, and showing just what some of these incidents can look like. So just take a moment. If you're able to view my screen, it's a very high-res video, so there is a chance that you're not seeing what I'm seeing. Nothing? Okay, we'll move on. All right, so we'll talk about today's learning objectives. So we're going to try in this short 40 minutes left to cover 4 learning objectives. So we want to talk about examining apparatus incident case studies. So this is an example of what some of those contributing factors look like and how it relates to collisions. We're going to describe the impact of the actual lights and sirens usage on those incidents. So what's the actual impact of just using lights and sirens? We're going to examine the medical priority dispatch system and priority dispatch in general, but specifically how it is used to triage EMS responses accurately and appropriately. And then finally, we're going to identify some of those lessons learned from McGregor and their participation in a fantastic collaborative that Robert will explain all about. A little note on the data. So we see that there's quite a difference in the reporting data available from EMS, fire, and law enforcement. So when it comes to EMS, even though it's actually the newest of these 3 disciplines, it is the most mature in its reporting capabilities. So you'll see that at the national level, we're actually recording on a pretty regular basis response mode and transport mode, and if there's any type of response delay, which could be an apparatus incident. So NEMSIS is really mature. The fire reporting platform, we don't have a national standard on whether or not your fire response use lights and sirens. So there is an initiative to transfer to the new nearest system, and hopefully I expect that there'll be a national data point on fire reporting when that eventually rolls out. And then finally, on the law side, there isn't an element for it. So the only time that you'll see lights and sirens even mentioned in a law enforcement national standard report is if it's collected in the narrative. So for this reason, we're going to be focusing a lot on the EMS data today. And really, it's because we have more to work with. To make up for that, we're going to use some case studies from the fire service. So why are we here today? Well, so we can see that just in 2020, there was over 180 deaths in emergency vehicle crashes. The vast majority of those were bystanders, the very folks that we're sworn to protect. We can see that it's the second leading cause of death for firefighter line of duty deaths. I know we spend a lot of time in law and fire talking about operating on roadways. It's pretty interesting that you're actually more likely to be involved in a fatal accident than you are to have an incident on a roadway when you're directing traffic or working on the side of the road for an MVC. So it's the second leading cause of death. With just using lights and sirens during your response, it increases our risk of having an apparatus incident by 40%. And during transport, it triples that risk. And it's responsible for almost 3/4 of all EMS fatalities. So EMS provider fatalities are transportation related. We'll start with our first case study. This occurred in December of 2021. This is from Kansas City, Missouri. This was a very, very well-known incident, so some of you may be familiar with this. But we're going to take a quick look at this video from security footage in a few different angles. We'll get started. The audio that you would be hearing is actually radio traffic between this responding pumper and dispatch. So here's the result of the scene. So it turns out that the individual operating that pumper was 21-year-old Dominic Biscari. They were responding to the report of a fire, and 60 seconds prior to the collision that we saw, they were actually canceled en route. This pumper was traveling 51 miles an hour in a 35-mile-an-hour zone, and again, they had already actually been canceled. So unfortunately, this resulted in the deaths of 3 civilians. The SUV that Dominic Biscari made contact with had 2 occupants, a driver and passenger, both of which perished in the incident. And then Tammy Knight was a pedestrian who was trying to get into her vehicle right where that pumper ended up landing into the sidewalk. As a result, the operator, 21-year-old Dominic Biscari, was found guilty of 3 counts of manslaughter and has $32 million in judgments against him. So this is his personal liability. This is what's happened to him as an individual. So as a new firefighter, the last thing that any of us would ever think is going to happen to us getting into this industry is ending up being a felon who's in debt for the rest of their life. And unfortunately, that's what's happened to Biscari. We'll examine what some of these contributing factors were as we kind of move through, but we'll get to our second case study. What you're seeing here is the explanation of a deadly crash in North Tazewell. So the captain who was operating this vehicle solo put one tire, so his passenger side tire, dropped off the right side of the road. When that happened, this cab over pumper rolled and killed the solo occupant. So this was Captain Sewell. So he was a 10-year veteran. He was operating this vehicle on his own. He was responding to an ATV incident that required a landing zone, and the pumper rolled. So again, this was a cab over pumper tanker. What's unfortunately interesting to note here is that those pumper tankers, or any vehicle that has over 1,000 gallons, is actually one of the most deadly vehicles we can operate. So you would think that tankers carrying more than 1,000 gallons would represent a high percentage of the apparatus that we operate. That's actually not the case. So pumper tankers are only responsible for about 3% of the apparatus on the road today, and they're responsible for 22% of all fatalities. The highest percentage of fatalities in the fire service coming from POVs, but tankers are particularly dangerous because they're carrying so much water at such a high center of gravity. Captain Sewell leaves behind a daughter and a pregnant wife. So we'll talk a little bit more about what these contributing factors look like. But before we get started, one more quick video. So this last video actually requires a little bit of audience participation. And what we're going to do is talk about attention. So you'll see that if you've ever seen this video before and you're sitting in the room with the folks there, please don't give the answer away. But there's a goal here. So what I'd like you to do is pay as close attention as you can to the group of individuals who are going to be playing a game of basketball. Actually, there's two games of basketball going on. One group in white t-shirts and one group in black t-shirts. So your goal of this video, and most people are actually very successful if they try, the goal of this video is to count the number of passes that the team in white successfully completes. They're going to try and fake you out, and there's going to be some, fake passes here and there. But if you pay attention, the goal here is to count the number of times that the team in white successfully completes the pass. Did that just pause for you, Robert?
It's going.
Okay. So if that made it through uninterrupted, then you would have counted 15 passes. But what you wouldn't have noticed was the gorilla who went across the screen. And so we call this inattention blindness. This is just one of the, thanks for the response, Kim, I see that. So this is just one of those types of issues that we can encounter. So there's lots of factors. And when we look at all of these types of factors, they seem to all be kind of out of our control, right? So we see all of these different factors that can contribute to apparatus incidents. However, what we're going to do is try and look at these in a little bit more of an organized way. So we're going to move these into really two major factors. So those that are within our control and those that are not within our control. And so we're going to touch base on each of these very quickly, but then we're going to focus on a few of them that are outside of our control that maybe we don't think about all the time. So obviously, operator distractions, and this happens frequently in all types of emergency response, can certainly contribute, right? Risky driving. So we can see that unfortunately, there seems to be an element of this in our industry. When we look at insurance rates, so we would think that typically if an individual has had an incident in the past, they're not necessarily more likely to have another incident, but that's not true. And the insurance industry has taught us that. So risky driving can be an individual issue, and if one person has had an incident in the past, they're more likely to have another incident. Operator fatigue. And we push this in our industry too. So with forced overtime and long shifts, 24s, 48s, we see that unfortunately operator fatigue is a real thing. If you're operating on less than 5 hours of sleep, you're actually twice as likely to be in an accident. And if you're operating on fewer than 4 hours of sleep, then you're actually 15 times as likely to be in an accident as you are if you are fully rested. This can be actually even more dangerous than operating under the influence, and we certainly don't allow that in emergency services. So really, this is a major consideration, and with the staffing crisis that we're all facing these days, it can be even more challenging. Vehicle specifications and maintenance. Obviously, a better maintained vehicle is a safer vehicle. We're looking at operator training, experience, and habits, right? So all of those things that are within our control, what we've learned, how we've been trained, how we respond. Our physical ability, the ability of an individual to actually press the brakes or turn the wheel in time, right? So there's a physical element there. I like to reference the F1 drivers. They're the fastest. They have the fastest response times, and the quickest of any operator that we know of on the ground, except for those fighter pilots, right? So, and then technology, there is lots of technology that can assist us in preventing apparatus incidents. So that includes the new HOS system, which will incorporate ways to notify other drivers where you are, and of course the opticons. The factors outside of our control, such as road conditions, which is very, there's not much we can do about that except know when to operate more safely. Our age and gender, which is pretty interesting. So you might think that, again, with the insurance folks, they've identified age as a major factor, and so that's why our new drivers have much higher insurance rates. But in emergency services, we actually see that age has much less of an impact than we might think, or in the general public. And gender is a little bit more interesting as well. So obviously, we see some gender differences in individuals, and we know that those are born male are more likely to take risks, particularly when we start talking about some of these other factors that we're going to explore here. Now we're going to focus a little bit on these final four. So cognitive bias, our sympathetic nervous system impacts, tunnel vision, and the driver recognition of emergency vehicles. Cognitive bias is a pretty interesting, tricky little guy. So there are over 200 cognitive biases, and we're going to talk about a few. So the first one is anything that we're given with too much information, we tend to filter out what we think is less important. So if we're faced with too much going on, too much information, which often happens when we're responding, we tend to notice only things that really stand out, right? So this is where some of that inattention blindness can come from too. There's too much going on, so we filter that out. When we have something that's not enough meaning, so we're presented with information that that we can't really associate with anything, or we can't provide meaning for, then we're going to fill in those gaps. And we're going to do that by relying on heuristics. So we're going to kind of go back to things that we do understand, and we're going to interpret in ways that we can. So we're going to look for those patterns. We're going to try and relate it to something that we already know. If we don't have enough time, then we're going to make some assumptions. So we're going to jump into ways to making those shortcuts, again, those heuristics, those ways that we can move through without having to, spend the time to process. And this is unfortunately exacerbated by driving quickly, right? So when we're operating fast, we're reducing our reaction times. And finally, if we don't have enough memory, so there's too much information. This is a working memory capacity overload. The example I like to give for a cognitive bias is that when we poll U.S. drivers and we say, okay, are you at least better than average at operating your personal motor vehicle? What we see is that an average would be 50%, but yet 90% of drivers will tell you that they are better than the average. This is a cognitive bias called the Dunning-Kruger effect. We tend to overestimate our own personal abilities at things. And unfortunately, this happens, and we're all capable of falling into this trap in emergency services, where we overestimate our ability to operate the vehicles that we're operating, to process the information that we're able to process, or to prevent ourselves from being distracted, or any of those other issues that we can run into. So if we take a look at our impacts of actual lights and sirens, we'll see that just by the actual operation of using lights and sirens, we know that given the same call, the same response, the same dispatch information, if we turn on those lights and sirens, we have an increase in our sympathetic nervous system. So we get that flood of endorphins, we get that fight or flight response. And we know that this happens just by simply turning on lights and sirens. We're able to, this is a physiological response that we can measure. And so when we look about how this impacts our decision making, there's a model called the stress-induced deliberation to intuition model. And what we're looking at here is when we're presented with the options, we're going to initially rely on our intuition, right? And we think about those cognitive biases, how we're trying to operate under stress. All of these modulators affect the way that we interact. Then there's an arbitrator. Should we change or not change? And finally, we go to deliberation and we make our decision. But what we find is that when we are under stress, that deliberation goes away and we go straight from intuition to our modulator and then finally to our decision-making ability. Tunnel vision and selective attention, we demonstrated that through our video. I implore you to spend some more time and take a look at this, bring this to your departments. Finally, driver recognition of emergency vehicle. What we see is that even though drivers know that they can be distracted by lights and sirens, still 3/4 of them are going to take pictures of an incident scene, and 1 in 10 have said they have either struck or nearly struck an emergency vehicle on the road. So this can, by simply operating the lights and sirens, not only are you impacting your sympathetic nervous system response, but you're also impacting those around you. So we're going to talk just very briefly about the medical priority dispatch system and how we can begin to move away from 100% lights and sirens response. And then Robert's going to take us through what they've done at his department and what that kind of model looks like. But right now, what we're seeing is that over the 2010 to 2015 nationally, we saw that about 3/4 of all responses were hot or running lights and sirens, but yet only about 1/4 of those had a transport that was hot. So what we want to explore a little bit is why the discrepancy. So why are we responding at such a higher rate than we're transporting with lights and sirens? And Robert's going to dive into that with you. The medical priority dispatch system is a dispatch system that's available. I know that Vermont has 6 separate PSAPs. I don't know, I wasn't able to determine which ones use the MPDS and which ones don't. But if you take anything from this, it would be that if you are using it, we're going to explain to you exactly why it's so powerful and so accurate. But know that there's 37 chief complaints, over 1,800 final determinants. These are prioritized, and this is used at over 3,700 dispatch centers worldwide. What we're looking at here is that we're increasing through Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and Echo. What we're doing is increasing the urgency of the call, not necessarily the importance of the call, but certainly the urgency. What most folks see, if anything, is that they've got an echo level medical. But know that if your PSAP is using the medical priority dispatch system, what they actually have is much more information. So that 9 Echo 1 will give you much more information about exactly what that diff breathing call is and how important it is. But a lot of dispatchers don't pass that information through. So from the PSAP to dispatch to EMS, and the priority dispatch system is available on both the fire and law side as well, but that's kind of outside the scope of what we're talking about today. Know that there's more information there. These dispatchers aren't allowed to freelance. They work through a very strict algorithm to come up with that one of those final 1,800 determinants, and that's where that 9 Echo 1 will come from. We're going to skip this because it's primarily audio. So this is an example of what a 911 call would look like, but we're gonna skip that since you won't be able to hear it. So unfortunately, that would give you a great step-by-step explanation and guide of exactly how that comes through and what that algorithm looks like. But it's not worth presenting without the audio today because you won't understand what the caller's saying and when. So, all right. So with that, I'll turn it over to Robert to discuss McGregor's initiative and collaborative with NEMSQA. So go ahead, Robert.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for that great overview into the what's and the whys and the hows of the way lights and sirens use can impact responder safety and public safety. So I'm going to be talking today about McGregor's specific experience over the past year and a half or so, trying to really take a more evidence-based look at our practices regarding lights and sirens use and tell you kind of where we've been with that. Same disclaimers that Nick gave at the beginning. We're talking about our experience. I'm talking about our experience. I'm not necessarily advocating for any one particular approach. I will provide a framework for you to consider if you or stakeholders in your community want to explore this more closely. But you know the saying that if you've seen one EMS system, you've seen one EMS system. Our experience may not fit for what your jurisdiction happens to do. I can advance the slides. Cannot advance the slides. Nick,
I can get it for you. Yeah, go
Great.
ahead.
Appreciate it. So the thing with lights and sirens use, and this is another one of those your mileage may vary situations, but in general, at least for our sort of suburban college town environments, we are safe. I guess by way of background before I dive into that, we serve 4 communities at McGregor EMS. We serve the towns of Durham, Madbury, and Lee, New Hampshire, as well as the University of New Hampshire. We're not a part of the university, but we are based on their campus. And in our pretty typical suburban New Hampshire operating environment, we save between 1.7 and 3.6 minutes by using lights and sirens, which is not nothing, but it's also not all that much. Nick talked a little bit ago about the difference between urgency and importance. Absolutely every 911 call that we receive is important, and it's an emergency to the person who called, and whoever that patient or patients are, they deserve compassionate and skilled care, and they're going to get it. What we need to figure out is when is it safe to go, well, it's never safe to go lights and sirens, but when is it appropriate or necessary to be taking on that extra risk? We have a saying that you risk a lot to save a lot. If I am bleeding to death, if I'm not breathing, then I need help as soon as it is absolutely possible to get it to me. If I have kidney stones or I fall and I break my arm, certainly I need care, but if I have to wait literally 2 more minutes for the ambulance to show up, and that means there's a much lower risk of there being a crash on the way to me, that's probably worth it. And so as we began tackling this issue, we decided to define what those things where the 2 minutes would really change the patient's outcome. And we're calling those PLSIs, potentially life-saving interventions. And again, that doesn't mean that anything that's not a PLSI isn't important or that the call doesn't matter, but it does mean that if I were to get to you 90 seconds later, it would be okay, as opposed to it might be too late at that point. Slide, please, Nick. So just to reiterate and add a few new statistics to what Nick had talked about already, every year there are about 8,400 collisions when emergency apparatus have lights and sirens operating, and that's just involving the apparatus. There's also something called the wake effect. Nick talked about the impact of lights and sirens use on everybody else on the roadway, and that's what we call the wake effect. So for every 1 EMS-involved incident, there are 4 additional crashes just between civilian vehicles. So there's a huge impact not just on the person who called 911 and the people who are responding to the event, but also to the rest of the public. Again, we risk a lot to save a lot, but we want to make sure that the benefit's worth the risk. And that's on the response side. On the transport side, you triple your risk of a crash, like Nick had said, for using lights and sirens. Slide, please. And so we do have this gulf, right? We have the response mode where the patient is sight unseen and we don't know what we're walking into. And then we have the transport mode, which we'll talk about in a moment. But at that point, at least, we have more information. Someone has shown up, they've assessed the patient, we've done vital signs or whatever it is we're going to do, but we're not operating more or less blind. Now in New Hampshire, we do use that emergency medical dispatch, the medical priority dispatch system, and so that gives us a little bit of extra information. Like Nick, I'm not super familiar with what the different jurisdictions in Vermont happen to use. I know it's not a statewide PSAP, so it may vary from place to place. And it's been about 12 years since I was a paramedic in Vermont, so I know that time has moved on. But at least in New Hampshire, we get those Alpha, Bravo, Charlie level determinants, and we know that both statewide and in our own department, there's extremely high specificity for these PLSIs. So omega is the lowest, which is odd because omega is the last letter in the Greek alphabet. But omega, then alpha, then Bravo, and then Charlie, Delta, and Echo are the worst or higher acuity calls, the presumed more urgent calls. The omegas, the alphas, the Bravos, we have a very high degree of confidence that if that call comes in coded to one of those three determinants, there is a low chance that a PLSI will be required on that call. We're still going to do right by the patient, but if it takes us an extra 90 seconds to get there and it reduces everybody's risk of getting into a roadway crash, it's going to be okay. It's not going to harm the patient. Charlie, Delta, Echo, we don't have that same level of confidence. Those are the kinds of calls where these PLSIs become much more common, and so those are the sorts of things we want to be going hot to. Slide, please. So just for our department's sake, we did, in that 7-year period, we did about 15,000 calls. We run between 2,000 and 2,200 a year right now. We found that we only performed these PLSIs on 3.5% of our calls over that 7-year period. And only 1.6% of those PLSIs, not of all the calls, but of those 3.5% of the PLSIs, only 1.6% of those were on Alpha, Bravo, or Omega level calls. Most of those were due to incorrect information being provided by the caller or something changing in the patient's condition after the 911 call had been placed. Is the patient conscious? Yes. Well, 45 seconds later, maybe that was no longer the case, and if we had known that in the beginning, it would have been Delta instead of Alpha. So a very low percentage of calls required these interventions at all, and an overwhelming majority of those were coded to that Charlie, Delta, and Echo level. So as a department, and really as a state, we have a ton of confidence that if we are being sent to something with a lower determinant, it's going to be safe to respond with our license sirens off. Slide, please. Now, we are not the only people looking at licensed sirens use. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which is kind of the government body that ultimately oversees EMS, they issued a white paper back in 2017 called Licensed Sirens Use by Emergency Medical Services, Above All, Do No Harm. And in that paper, they were calling for a more judicious use of licensed sirens, a more systematic use of licensed sirens, and an evidence-based use of licensed sirens. And so that white paper came out, and as is often the case with white papers, a few people read it and nothing changed. Until, slide please. Last year, there was a joint statement issued on licensed sirens vehicle operations, and it was issued by, whatever it is, I think it's 11 stakeholders, maybe it's 13, and it is a wide range of interests here. The American College of Emergency Physicians, the American Ambulance Association, the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch, the group that developed the MPDS, International Association of Fire Chiefs, National Association of EMS Physicians, National Volunteer Fire Council. You've got hospital-based, you've got research, you've got EMS, you've got fire. You have a lot of stakeholders from across the spectrum who signed on to this. The International Association of Firefighters, which is the Firefighters Union, did not, but the reason for that is they had already issued their own paper something like 15 years before that said all the same things. So they were already on record as supporting this. Slide, please. And the next one. And so the National EMS Quality Alliance put together a collaborative, a licensed sirens collaborative. It was 50 departments from across the country. It was actually 48 from across the country and 2 from Canada. And this ran about 16 months or so. and the objective was to drive down lights and sirens use as much as was clinically reasonable. We were the only department in New Hampshire to participate. Offhand, I don't think there was a Vermont department, but I certainly apologize if there was and I'm overlooking you. Slide, please. Their goal was to drop our cold response, or to increase our cold response rate for all program participants to 70% and try to do 95% of cold transports. Slide, please. And the next one. And we were able to get pretty close. We went from 5% cold responses to 50% cold responses and 60% cold transports and to 95%. We did hit that one, and we got pretty close on the response modes. It was mildly terrifying to me to realize that we had been doing 40% hot transports before this, but getting that down to 5% was pretty good. We felt good about that. Slide, please. So we issued I think it says page 1 of 2, but it's actually 4 pages now, a 4-page internal guideline for how to handle both response and transports. I'm not going to go through it with you because, again, you've seen one department. Anybody who's interested in our policy, I'd be more than happy to share it with you for something to use as a jumping off point for your own jurisdictions, but we're not going to spend time on it now. Slide, please. And I mentioned we can have a really high degree of confidence that the lower urgency determinants are going to be lower acuity, and that was our experience as well. During the study period, we had 1,100 Omega Alpha and Bravos. None of them were status 1. 2 of them were status 2, but both got discharged from the ER. They met stroke and sepsis criteria, but were not actually. And then the rest were much lower acuity. Slide, please. And the next one. And the next one. So we have this concept of racing to the wall, right? We show up at the hospital and they make us wait 15 minutes for a bed. Well, if I drove hot to get there, the chances of that having been worth it were pretty low because the deliverable of arrival at actual care at the hospital hasn't been met yet. I can wait for 15 minutes, I can wait for 17 minutes, patients getting seen at the same point anyway, so why not be a little bit safer in the way we go? However, there are going to be some times that we need to be going hot, and so we had an internal hot transport policy. Again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it because that was the one our department used. Yours could be different if you have different needs or different opinions from your stakeholders. But this is something we determined with our quality assurance committee, our medical director, ER leadership at our receiving hospital, the stroke, trauma, cardiac, and sepsis programs at our receiving hospitals. So there were a lot of people who had their fingers on this, and it was a policy that everybody was happy with. And I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to have a broad coalition working on these things because it's going to impact a lot of individuals, not just your specific apparatus. Slide, please. Now, we did learn in this process, McGregor is a combination department. It is paid paramedics working with volunteer EMTs and advanced EMTs. It's probably 85% volunteers, 15% staff. And, you know, the ship turns slowly sometimes. And this is a big change in how we do business. And it's a big change in how everybody does business. And emotions can trump data. We have the data. It is borderline irrefutable. But it's still hard to wrestle with that emotions piece. Well, but what if? But what if? But what if? You know, and those things are hard to overcome. And it's just the reality of doing things differently in medicine that there's always going to be a little bit of that resistance to change. However, slide please. We have found that instead of just taking stuff away from people, giving something back can also make it easier to get department, rank and file level buy-in. And so we focused on chutes time, on getting out the door. How long does it take from when the tones go off to when the garage door goes up and you start rolling out? If it's taking you 2 or 3 minutes to get out the door, you're only going to save less than that going lights and sirens. It's much safer to get out the door in 45 seconds and then go cold. You're still at the patient's side faster. It's something you can control, and no one's getting into a wreck on the highway. So we've been able to get a lot of buy-in from our membership by not just taking away something, but by replacing it with something and helping them to see that this is going to allow them to do what they want, which is do the right thing for the patient, but in a safer way. Slide, please. And the next one. We're looking at expanding some of our cold responses into the Charlies, Deltas, and Echoes based on the data we have in conjunction with our stakeholders. Anybody who's interested in what that's going to look like for us, be happy to talk about it offline, but I'll skip it for now. Slide, please. And the next one. And we click through for 3 more because there's a few bullet points on this one. Thank you. So the last thing I want to talk about is the framework that we used that I think any other interested department may find useful. We started by figuring out, gathering the data. What is our hot response and hot transport rate? What are the PLSIs that are important to our department? You know, CPR, defibrillation, patient not breathing, those are the easy ones. Some of the fringe cases may vary from medical director to medical director, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Involve your medical direction, involve your hospitals, build that broad coalition to decide which of these cases you want going hot versus cold, being mindful of the impact on the responders and the public of using lights and sirens, and then track your outcomes. Work with your hospitals, work with your stakeholders to be able to show, yes, this is the change we've had and there have been no adverse incidents, so go us, or this isn't working the way we thought, so we might need to make some adjustments. More than happy to discuss with anybody else who's interested in this offline, but slide, please. This is our contact information. If you'd like to reach either of us, we thank you for your time and attention today, and we'd be happy to take any questions that you have now in the remaining time.
Looks like we've got one from Alex. I don't know if you're able to unmute yourself, Alex, but you can go for it.
Can you hear me?
We can.
We can hear you.
All right. Thank you so much. Very interesting and timely for me. Wondering if you've done any research on lights and siren response with volunteers, not necessarily the professional EMS or fire, but in terms of, in Vermont we have something called red light permits for our volunteers, and I'm curious if there is a body of evidence out there that discusses the rates of accident versus non-accidents with POVs and with red light permits.
We know that POVs are the most deadly. If you count your POV en route to either direct to the scene or to the firehouse or EMS agency, they are the most deadly vehicle that we operate as first responders. So more first responders die in POVs than any other piece of apparatus. So in terms of how are those incidents recorded, unfortunately, we don't have the national data point for that in any of the sectors of public safety to examine the en route to either scene or station by POV. So that data point's not available. We do know that it's the most deadly piece that you operate, and probably just because there's so many more of them. I hope that answers your
okay,
question.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
But I would recommend, and so what we've done in my department, if you decide to examine this, we have applied the same POV policy, the same lights and sirens response policy to POVs that we have to apparatus.
Gotcha.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
I see a question. How many non-03 accidents have there been with the same amount of responses? I'm not sure I quite understand that question, Emily. Does that make sense to you, Robert? Do you see it in the chat? Oh, non-code 3. Have there been with the same amount of responses? When we ran, do you want to take that, or do you want me to take it?
All yours.
So essentially what we did when we examined the data, Emily, what we did was look at the percentage of responses. So there is a resources tab here. So this is where all of our research came from. So the percentage of responses and bulk data is available through the resources here. But what we did is pare that down into a percentage that we felt was a little easier for everyone to digest. So we know that on the EMS side, you are 40% more likely to have an incident if you're running lights and sirens than not, and you're 3 times as likely to have an incident during transport.